Alright, what we want to do now is make a really minimalist user profile page. But of course, in order to have a profile page for a user, you actually need to have a user in the database. And that introduces a kind of chicken and egg problem, because how do you have a user if you don't already have a registration form? The answer is that we can bootstrap the process by creating a user at the console, which we did at the end of the last lesson. There's the first user in the database. If you do not currently have a user, you should create one now, because we're going to need one for what we're about to do. Alright, so let's take a look at the page that we actually want to use for the user profile. It's going to be at /users/1. You can see that there's nothing there right now. It just gives us an error. Let's see here. No route matches get/user/1. So this is part of the REST architecture. Remember from lesson 2, it's representational state transfer. It's a set of standard URLs with standard behavior. In this case, we want /the resource name, which is users, /the ID to be a page for that user. In other words, the profile page. So we can get that to work by introducing, I guess I just closed the routes, we need it again. We can introduce a resource in the routes, resources, and then we give it a symbol, and it's a plural by convention, resources users. So now you can see that it's still an error, but it's a different problem. In this case, the problem is that there's no show action. So we can go to our users controller and put in a show action. So it'll give us a different error. Now we're missing the show template, so let's do that. It's going to be in views, users. And now I just want to, let's just start off with the user's name and email. We won't actually expose the email on the real site, but this is just to give us a sense of actually having the information in the database being displayed on the application. So let's start with this. So what we're going to do is define an instance variable @user. Remember that this instance variable, when defined in a controller, is automatically available in the views. So we're going to say user.name. Let's just put in the user's name and email address here. So just to get started. So we can take a look at this. This won't work, of course, because we don't actually have a name for this @user, because there is no @user. Now this is a very common kind of error message. You can see here it says undefined method name for nil class. And you might think, well, what's going on there? And the answer is that regular variables, if you try to access, say, an attribute, will just give you an error. So in fact, let me start up the console again. Suppose I did this. So user.name, this will give me one kind of error. This will complain that there is no user. But the way that instance variables work is that, in fact, they do exist. So @user, in a sense, I mean, they don't exist in the sense that they're nothing, they're nil, but they're not undefined. So instance variables, if you try to access them when they're not defined, will return nil rather than giving you an error. So if I just do this, it'll say that there's no such variable, right? Undefined local variable, but @user will just return nil. So if you get an error in your browser or in a test that complains about something not existing on a nil class, that means that you didn't define the variable. Or in particular, it means you didn't define the necessary instance variable. So we can define that in here. You can say @user equals, and see if you can figure this out. Remember what we did in the last lesson. How do we find users in the database? We did something like this. User.first returns the first user. In fact, that will actually work here. Take a look at it. There it is. Name and email address. That's right. But of course, this only works for this one user. So we can generalize this, but by recalling the find method. User.find of 1, which is the ID. There we go. So let's look at our browser. Remember, we've got this debug information. So in the debug information, you can see that we've got the controller, which is the user's action show, and we've got this ID, which is 1. So remember that we put in this, this template. Here it is. This is debug of params. So what this thing is here, this is a representation using a format called YAML of the params hash. So params is effectively a series of key value pairs, controller users, action show, ID 1. So what we can do is we can pull out that ID in the user's controller like this. Params, and then a symbol corresponding to the attribute, in this case ID. So params of ID here is just this 1. So if we refresh this, it should be the same, and there it is. By the way, you might notice that here I used an integer, but params of ID is actually the string, but the find method is actually smart enough to convert this thing to an integer before trying to find it in the database. So this is a great start, even though it's really minimal. We are actually now dynamically pulling out the information from the database using user.find and displaying the information to a web page. And you can see, because we're actually using this ID, that this is going to work for lots of other different IDs. And so by writing one piece of code here, this profile page, we'll effectively have a profile page for every single user in the database, which could be thousands or even millions.